Welcome to 5 Good Questions. I'm your host, Jake Taylor. Our guest today is Matt Ridley. Matt's books have sold over 1 million copies and have been translated into 31 languages and won several awards. His TED Talk, When Ideas Have Sex, has been viewed more than 2 million times. With a PhD from Oxford University, Matt worked for The Economist for 9 years as science editor. He sits in the House of Lords and is a member of the Science and Technology Committee. Today we're going to be discussing his book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Let's ask Matt 5 good questions. But first, I'm happy to announce my literary debut, The Rebel Allocator, is now available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. You could say it's about time. I've been pouring my heart into this book for more than 3 years. A well-known SoCal billionaire received an early copy of the book and actually called me to say he enjoyed the story and was adamant that I get it made into a movie. Talk about a surreal experience getting 20 minutes on the phone with one of my heroes. My friend Tobias Carlyle had this to say: Jacob Taylor has written a modern-day investment classic. The Rebel Allocator is reminiscences of a stock operator for value investors. It's a fictionalized retelling of the lessons in The Intelligent Investor in an accessible page-turner. If you want to learn how to invest like Warren Buffett by sitting at his knee, this is the book for you. Wow, how flattering is that? I was blown away when he sent me that. I've created dozens of ad-free author interviews over the last 5 years and never asked for anything in return. If you've gotten any value out of these efforts, please do me a personal favor and pick up a copy of The Rebel Allocator. I promise you won't regret it. And now, on with the show. All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. My guest today is Matt Ridley, and he's the author of How Innovation Works.
That's right. It's a book that's coming out in May. If the virus allows, it's How Innovation Works, and the subtitle is And Why It Flourishes in Freedom.
Yeah, so I have to give a little bit of background here. The first time that I remember hearing your name, I actually remember it. I was at Berkshire Hathaway. This is about 10 years ago, and Charlie Munger, people ask him for book recommendations, and he recommended The Rational Optimist. And I wrote it down in my notes, like, oh, I should follow up with that. So I read it, and
I was very grateful for Charlie's recommendation. It was good stuff. Yeah,
I'm sure that helped book sales. So then I went back. I've read everything I think that you've written since, and I was kind of joking a little before we started that I haven't been nervous in doing one of these in quite a while, but I was actually a little nervous for this one because I literally, Matt, you're my favorite author. So this is a big deal for me.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope I don't change that in the next half hour.
It'd be hard for you. You've built up a lot of goodwill already. So let's jump into talking about your book. The question number one is, what was the single most important event in the history of humankind? Not that that's like a small thing to identify, but and why was it so important?
Right. Well, this is how I start my book. I say the most important event in the history of humankind happened around 1700, and it happened either in France or Britain. We're not quite sure which, and we're not quite sure who it happened to. So how can I say it's the most important event in the history of humankind if I know so little about it? And the answer is because I think in retrospect, looking back, we can see that the moment when heat was used to do work was the moment when civilization really took off, when prosperity began to spread, because it's that trick of being able to produce heat whenever you want and turn that heat into work through a steam engine originally, but also later an internal combustion engine, a turbine, all these other devices, is really the secret of how we came to be so successful. Now, who did this occur to? Who was the person who first made this into an innovation? Well, you can go right back to the ancient Greeks and say that they were building little toy steam engines, but that doesn't really mean very much. What counts is doing it on a scale that could actually change the world. And there's a key French genius called Denis Papin who was doing a lot of experiments in this area, was a friend of Leibniz, a friend of Boyle, an enemy of Newton, of course, because any friend of Leibniz was an enemy of Newton. And he had a really tragic life. He seems to have fallen out with everybody, and he traveled all over the place. He went to Venice, he went to Britain, he went to Germany, ended up back in Britain, and he died in obscurity, in poverty, and nobody had really taken up his idea. But his ideas were a little bit theoretical. there was a Brit called Captain Savary, Thomas Savary, who actually built a steam engine, but it didn't really work. He couldn't sell it to anyone for any practical purposes because it had no power really. It pumped a little bit of water, which was the plan, but it didn't do very much. And meanwhile, from obscurity, and we don't know how, comes a guy called Thomas Newcomen, who was a sort of blacksmith really from the west of England, from Devon, and he suddenly appears in 1712 with what is effectively the proper first working big steam engine based on the atmospheric engine principle. And it looks like something that's got that owes a little bit to Papin and a little bit to Savary and maybe a little bit to something else, to his own genius. But we don't know. He might have just invented it independently of the other two. So it's a wonderful example of how obscure the origins of some of our most crucial innovations are. And it's also an example of how to innovate, to bring something new into the world that really changes the world rather than just turns into a toy. You have to do trial and error, experiment, cross-fertilization of ideas. It's not a process of genius insights or bringing science down from the mountaintop like Moses. You know, it's a sort of journeyman's, ordinary person's tinkering process. And I think that's a very important lesson. So that's why I put it right at the start of the book. That and the fact that, as I say, energy is crucial to everything that we do. We create improbability. Every book on the shelves behind you is an improbable structure full of improbable ideas. That's the whole point of them, is that they couldn't have come about randomly, and to do that we need to put energy into the system to defeat entropy, to bring about order. So energy innovations are absolutely core to the whole of human history, in my view.
Yeah, that's great. Isn't it funny? It seems like how a lot of times toys are kind of on the leading edge of some technology breakthroughs, or at least garage tinkering.
That's absolutely right. There's play is quite an important feature of innovation. There's quite a lot of great innovators who talk about how they play with ideas. And as you say, tinkering. And again and again, this theme that you have to do a lot of trial and error before you come up with the right idea. Error. You've got to do a lot of error. You've got to get it wrong again and again and again. Jeff Bezos is very good on this. He says, most of the ideas we had for Amazon were really bad ideas, and they went nowhere. But every now and then we had a good one, and we just kept rolling the dice. I don't think that was the metaphor he uses, but we kept
throwing spaghetti against the wall, I think, is the
That's right. Exactly.
So question number 2, if you think we kind of transition on this timeline from campfires to burning dung, whale oil, kerosene, Edison's light bulb, and CFLs, and then finally LEDs, like what about this sort of sweeping arc of history for humanity as far as how we just simply light our homes can tell us about innovation?
Yeah, it's a lovely example to choose, lighting, because it's first of all, it's the metaphor for innovation. The light bulb is the common metaphor, but also it's just a very nice example of something that went from being a luxury to being a necessity, that went from being very expensive and very difficult to being very cheap and very ubiquitous, and that did so by transitioning from one technology to another, and in that sense goes by giant leaps. But actually, when you look at it more closely, it's a series of incremental steps that don't do much improvement on the previous technologies until they gradually do, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. Just to give you an idea of how the cost of lighting has come down, if you wanted to to turn on an ordinary lamp this evening using an LED, and you were going to read a book for an hour, and you wanted about enough light to do that. How long would you have to work on the average wage to earn that much light? And the answer is about a quarter or a third of a second. Okay. Now, in 1950, with a incandescent bulb and lower wages, you would have had to work for about 8 seconds to earn that much light, which is quite a big difference. 1880, with a kerosene lamp on the average wage, 15 minutes of work for 1 hour of light. 1800, 6 hours. 6 hours of light to get that much light, 6 hours of work to get that much light from a tallow candle. These are calculations done by Bill Nordhaus, an economist. And if you go back even further, it's probably even more costly with sesame oil lamps and whale oil lamps and all these kind of things that people were using. So this incredible reduction in cost. And at each stage, somebody sits down and thinks, you know what, I could do a better job of producing light. And the crucial breakthrough really is the 1870s, when Edison first comes up with his light bulb. And the really interesting thing is that there are 21 different people who come up with the same idea for a light bulb, an incandescent light bulb, in that decade alone. And some of them know each other, but most of them don't. It's independent of each other. It's just the idea is ripe. Mm-hmm. And if Edison was run over by a tram, we'd still have light bulbs. It was not possible to prevent the invention of the light bulb. That's what makes some of these innovations look extraordinarily inevitable, at least in retrospect. The search engine of the 1990s is another example. If Google wasn't founded, we'd still have search engines. And yet nobody saw it coming. Nobody said, oh, we're about to invent the light bulb. So that's a paradox that I find very interesting. And Edison was the past master of innovation as opposed to invention. He wasn't, I think, a great inventor, but he was a great innovator, because what he did was he did this endless trial and error. He recognized that novelty was a product, that you could actually set up a factory to produce new things that worked. And in the case of the light bulb, he tried 5,000 different plant materials before he settled on bamboo. And that's the kind of hard work that has to be done. Now, we quite recently made the transition from incandescent light bulbs to compact fluorescent light bulbs to LEDs. And the interesting thing is that we forced the transition from incandescence to compact fluorescence. All around the world, governments basically said, right, we're going to force you to not sell incandescents. You've got to, if you're going to sell anything, it's compact fluorescent, because we want to save energy. These things use less energy for the amount of light they give. But they had serious disadvantages. They tended to warm up more slowly. They tended to give slightly less good light. They had real pollution issues when you discarded them. They were more expensive as well in capital terms, even though they ran with less electricity. So that's why the transition had to be forced. And actually, it was partly at the behest of some light bulb companies that this was done. I mean, they did very well out of it. And a few years later, an unforced transition happened from compact fluorescence to LEDs. And if governments had only kept out of the way, then I think we'd have made the transition straight from incandescents to LEDs without going down the compact fluorescent route along the way, because a Japanese professor had made a crucial breakthrough in the 90s that enabled us to do all the colors that you need in light from an LED.
To get white, finally.
To get proper white, exactly. That's the point.
Yeah. So question number 3, this is a little bit more of a kind of a macro question, but something that I've been thinking about is, do you think that the use of debt allows us to pull innovation from the future? So almost like overclocking a computer.
I don't even know what overclocking a computer means, but I think I can guess. And I think it's a really interesting question, and it's not one I think I've got a very good answer to. But I see what you're getting at, and I think it's a really intriguing question. I mean, one of the questions I've enjoyed asking economists over the years and never got a terribly straight answer to is the world in debt? And if so, who to? We're not in debt to Mars. We're in debt to ourselves. If we're in debt to ourselves, then we're not in debt. The credits must equal the debts. Now, you might have misvalued either the debt or the credit, so they might be out of whack. But in theory, everything that somebody has borrowed, they've borrowed from somebody else on the planet, and the savings somewhere match the. So in that sense, we don't borrow from the future. But in another sense, we clearly do, in that it's you borrow and you expect your grandchildren to pay back, at least when it comes to the federal deficit. I suspect that's what you're up to, and we're up to here in the UK too. And it's going to get worse in the next couple of years, I suspect. But an innovator needs capital. And crucially, it's quite important to note that the really great innovations happened in capital-rich areas. The Netherlands in the 17th century, Britain in the 18th and 19th century, Germany, California. You can't do this without injecting a lot of money into it. Sometimes that's public money, sometimes it's private money, but a lot of it will have been borrowed. And in that sense, if you can organize your financial system so that you can take on equity or debt, that you can get people to lend you a lot of money that you can put into producing an innovation that will then pay back by earning your grandchildren or other people's grandchildren in the same country or something like that a lot of money, then yes, you are pulling forward from the future. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Because if we all the only reason we borrowed was for current spending, not for investment in innovation, in genuine capital innovations, then we wouldn't get anywhere. We'd just be going around in circles. So I think that's right. You have to have a way of concentrating cash where it's needed to do unusual things that wouldn't normally be done with money.
I think one of the arguments maybe that might explain it somewhat is like Hernando de Soto's book about the mystery of capitalism, where especially like South America, where they didn't have good property rights, you couldn't borrow against your house to start that business that was going to change the world. And so you're kind of stuck in this, like you can't get up onto the ladder, even onto square one.
That's absolutely right. And I think Hernando de Soto's analysis is fantastically useful and key to understanding. His point really is that property rights is what worked for America, Britain and other countries when they were industrializing, when they were growing very fast. And we have to find a way of making sure that people can do that. And it's amazing what people will do when they borrow money to do it. I mean, a good example, I think, of an innovator who used debt and the capital system very well is Marconi, Guglielmo Marconi, the inventor of radio. He wasn't necessarily much better at science or technology than any of his rivals. He was basing it on some work by some very key, brilliant German scientists, but he was an entrepreneur, a very good entrepreneur. He had a lot of help from. He came to the UK from Italy to do his business building there, and instead of handing the idea to some businessman to turn into a business, he turned it into one himself, and the Marconi company became this huge company. And of course the technology kept changing. He didn't realize at first that this was a technology for broadcast. He thought it was for communication, the kind of thing you and I are doing right now, rather than one-to-many broadcasting. And he was a ferocious and perhaps over ferocious defender of his own intellectual property. Spent a lot of time in court trying to defeat people who were after his monopoly, as it were. But yeah, no, it's an example of it couldn't have happened without the deep financial markets that he tapped in mainly London in order to build the immensely expensive technology to transmit messages even across the Atlantic by the time once he got started.
Yeah. As a follow-on to that, what do you think about patent protection?
Well, on the whole, after telling the stories that I tell in my book about innovations, I'm pretty skeptical about intellectual property generally, and patents in particular. Again and again, I came across examples where innovators spent their second half of their careers banging their heads against a legal brick wall trying to defend their intellectual property and spending a fortune doing so, when they could have just got on and been quicker to the next innovation or to exploiting their innovation than other people. The evidence that you need a 17-year or whatever it is monopoly on the profits from your invention to incentivize you to do it are not very good. There's been lots of studies of this. Countries that didn't have proper intellectual property systems at certain times were just as inventive as ones that didn't, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact that we have hugely strengthened intellectual property rights in recent years through legislation, both copyright and patents, to me is a mistake. I don't think the evidence is there. It's great for the incumbents who are exploiting these patents, and you get a lot of companies now who actually see it as their business to exploit existing patents and make money out of them.
Yeah, trolls.
Rather than use trolls, exactly. Yeah, trolls and patent thickets and that kind of thing. I don't think that it's as useful well. Here's an important point. You mentioned property rights a few minutes ago, and I think the very phrase intellectual property is a mistaken analogy, because my home can be occupied by me and my family, or you and your family, but not both. Well, I mean, it could just, but it would be a squash. Whereas the same is not true of my idea. Thomas Jefferson famously said, I can give you an idea and still have it, just as I can give you light from a flame from a taper and still have flame on my own taper. And that's a crucial characteristic of innovations and ideas, is that you can give them away and still have them, and that's not true of physical property.
So question number 4, of course we got to talk something about COVID-19 given the state of the world right now, but what do maybe past responses to health epidemics teach us about what we can do in dealing with COVID? I'm shocked by what's happened in the last few months. I thought we were better at coping with novel emerging viruses than it turns out we are. Most of the time, recent epidemics have turned out not to be as frightening as they might be. Turns out this time, Mother Nature has hit on a devilishly good combination of contagiousness, lethality, and asymptomatic transmission. And all the knowledge that we've gained about genomics of viruses and messenger RNA vaccines and so on turns out not to have speeded up the process of producing a vaccine at all, which is concerning. But if we go back and look at history, obviously previous generations were far more vulnerable to diseases than we are, and we defeated every one after another, and we will, in due course, defeat this one. I spent a bit of time talking about the origin of vaccination itself, of inoculation, really, I should say, because it was originally, it was a little bit different, and where it comes from. And both in the UK and the US, the idea arrived independently from people who had been to Constantinople and had learnt the practice from women in the Ottoman Empire. And in Britain, it's a woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who was the wife of a diplomat at Constantinople. And while she was there, she discovered that the local women had this practice of giving a very small sample of smallpox from somebody who'd survived or was surviving the epidemic to a child and getting a mild version of the disease and then having immunity. And this is a crazily dangerous idea when you think, what do you mean you're going to deliberately infect my child with a lethal disease? Even the process was pretty disgusting.
Exactly. And she didn't invent it. It was invented in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, it probably wasn't. It was probably invented in China, and the Ottomans got it from China. We don't really know where it was invented. But she's an innovator because she comes back to the UK, and somebody does something similar in New England, and says, look, here's this practice. I want to spread this practice. I want influential people to use it and then give it to other people and she even persuades the Prince of Wales to inoculate his children, and this then catches on, and that's all marvelous. But at the time there are riots and they try and burn down her house because they think she's an irresponsible and dangerous woman spreading a pseudoscientific idea. Another example of the huge resistance to innovation that is a big theme that I also write about in my book. So that's one case we can look at, albeit a long time ago and in very different circumstances. I'm also very keen on a lovely story in the 1930s of a woman called Pearl Kendrick and her colleague, who set out to invent a vaccine to whooping cough, which was at the time a really dangerous disease, killing an awful lot of people, particularly in poor households. And in their spare time, these two women decided to try and they were medical biologists. It wasn't as if they were amateurs, but they in their spare time, they just devoted some of their time in the laboratory to seeing whether they couldn't develop a whooping cough vaccine using all the standard techniques, but being very careful, very cautious, and yet very determined, and going out into the slums, into households to find out what was going on actually with these people, and learning learning when people were still infectious and when they weren't, how long they had to be in quarantine, and then eventually working on a vaccine. And they did it. They came up with a vaccine which went into wide use around the end of the 1930s, so it rather got missed as a great innovation because of the outbreak of war soon afterwards. And also they were very modest women who didn't take much credit. They didn't make any money. It's a beautiful example of what can be done if people are determined to do it. So I think I also talk about the fight against polio and the risks that were run there. I mean, some unready vaccines were used, which actually gave people polio in the early days. This was a terrible mistake. And so, and it's not impossible, by the way, that the early AIDS epidemic was aided by the use and reuse of needles throughout Africa in order to give people antibiotics and other injections, vitamin injections, in fact, well-meaning programs, but actually they may have amplified the HIV virus. So the fight against infectious diseases is an incredibly important area of innovation, and one that isn't straightforward, that does go wrong. Some things like whooping cough turn out to be quite easy to develop a vaccine against. Others, like coronavirus, may prove to be quite difficult.
Yeah, no, we're getting a full taste of how vulnerable we are to it.
Well, I have to say, as an optimist, I've been surprised by this. I did find that I wrote a short book about the future of disease in 1999, about the coming millennium, and I went back and looked what I said in that, and on the whole, I was relatively optimistic, but I did say that if we are going to have a pandemic, it'll almost certainly be a virus, not a bacterium or a parasite. It will almost certainly be respiratory, because we're really good at transmitting respiratory diseases, whereas we've cut down most of the other methods by which we spread diseases, lice and mosquitoes and things like that. And it will probably come from bats. I actually said that because bats are another mammal. They live in big clusters like us. They breed these respiratory viruses, and we're messing around with bats a bit more than we used to, and maybe we shouldn't. So I have a little bit of I told you so about me, but not much, because I didn't then spend the next 20 years ringing alarm bells and saying we are playing Russian roulette with epidemiology here. And it turns out the world should have done much more to prepare for this. There was a center set up by the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation called the Center for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which is a great place, and it's doing great work, but it only started in 2017 and it's hardly got going yet, and it's too late. We should have started that 20 years ago. Yeah.
So question number 5, has science gotten so complex, so specialized, so expensive that sort of accidental garage tinkering that has led us up to this point? Like, it seems very difficult to be a gentleman scientist anymore. For I can't go probably build a thorium reactor in my garage right now very easily. So
I'd love to watch you try.
Yeah, I'm sure. I can't make a pencil by myself, right? But
yes and no. On the one hand, of course, there are technologies like nuclear today that are way beyond the capacity of individuals or even small businesses. They've got to be big companies. Although I'm looking at some fusion work that's now being done in the private sector by not small companies, but relatively modest companies. There's 2 or 3 in the US and 1 in the UK and another one somewhere else, who are starting to look like they might have promising ideas about how to get fusion going. So it's not all a big boys game, as it were. And at the same time, don't forget today that an awful lot of the innovation that's changed your and my life in the last 20 years has been digital innovation. And that digital innovation has, on the whole, been done in the equivalent of a garage, and often on a very small scale with unbelievably little capital to start with. And I actually write about a phenomenon called user-derived innovation in the book, which is when people who actually use products then tinker with them and improve them and sell those back to other users. And a very nice example is a thing called Night Scout, which is a method of remotely monitoring the insulin status of diabetic patients, which was developed by several different parents of insulin-dependent diabetic children who wanted to just be able to keep an eye on what was happening to their kids without necessarily having to be present in the room. And these technologies have caught on, and some of the manufacturers are now sort of manufacturing them for them. But they were hacks. They were ordinary people just doing this out of self-interest, really. And go back 100 years, and the same is true. There are tinkerers in bicycle shops like the Wright brothers with very little money, but there are also giant, almost Manhattan-style projects like the one that enabled Otto Frisch and Fritz Haber to invent the Haber process, by which fixing nitrogen from the air for the use as fertilizer and also explosive. Which was an enormous industrial operation to crack a really difficult problem about getting high pressure, high temperature and catalysts to work at the same time on ammonia, to make ammonia, and took up a huge chunk of Germany's industrial investment around that time. And that's in the early part of the 20th century, at the same time the Wright brothers are doing something much cheaper just across the pond.
So with as using that sort of as a continuum of, like Langley and the Wright brothers, and then,
yes,
that one is obviously very much in favor of the tinkerer, but, the Haber process being more towards the other side. Do you think that there's more or less room for, let's say, like government style Manhattan Project, like basic science research, or are we better left private sector kind of tinkering?
Well, both. We clearly need both. The government takes 40% of our money off us, and it's a pity if it doesn't spend any of that on supporting innovation. And of course, we need science. Science is one of the great cultural prizes of our civilization, in my view. And I see it more as a prize than a fuel, if you see what I mean. A lot of people talk about science these days as being something that's necessary for innovation. I don't think that's right, actually. I think science is often the daughter of technology rather than the mother of technology, sometimes one way, sometimes the other. But the point about science is not to produce useful objects. The point about science is to produce glorious insights into the way the world is. It's like art in that sense. It's a great achievement. And we've fallen into the habit of having most science paid for by the government in recent decades. And I'm not sure that's necessary. I think there's a lot of evidence that private sector would fund science. You're seeing it with some of the modern digital billionaires funding space research and astronomy and other things as well. So I think it's possible that the private sector would fund quite a lot of science. But when it comes to technology and the development of innovations, government obviously has some successes, nuclear power, the space race, other things. But even there, it depended quite heavily on the private sector to, be contractors to it, as it were. If you look at the Manhattan Project, it's using a lot of private contractors, and same for the Apollo project. And conversely, if you look at the other side of the coin, great private sector projects like the internet have their origins partly in government-sponsored work too. So I think in the end, we need to think that both are valuable. I personally think that most of the conversation at the moment tends to undervalue the private investment and overvalue the government one. But that's a bias in the commentary rather than saying that one is important and the other's not.
So bonus question that we always ask, and this is for a book recommendation. And typically looking for something that is maybe off the beaten path a little bit, not the standard fare that you hear a lot of times. So what do you have today?
You probably know of the book The Power of Bad.
I haven't heard of that.
Which is no good. Well, it's just very recently come out. It's by John Tierney and Ray Baumeister. And John Tierney's a New York Times writer, and he's written books with Baumeister before, who's a psychology professor. It's called The Power of Bad, and it's why negative thinking is so powerful. And it's got some really nice ideas in it, and it's full of beautiful examples of the issue. So I would strongly recommend that. It's very well written as well. So just to give you an example of the kind of thing he talks about, there's a phenomenon called the optimism gap, which I was puzzled by when I wrote The Rational Optimist, and that is that people are, on the whole, very pessimistic about the planet and about their country, but they're very optimistic about their own lives. They tend to be too optimistic about their own lives and too pessimistic about the human race. Why is that? It's a strange sort of disconnect.
Context differences.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you think you're going to live a long time and have a happy life, why can't everyone else?
Yeah.
But I mean, and I struggled to come up with a good explanation for why that is. At the end, I just said, well, it's something to do with human psychology. But actually, of course, Baumeister and Tierney say, no, hang on, it's very obvious what it is. It's because the media tells us that the planet is doomed the whole time, and it doesn't tell us that your own life is doomed. It's an echo of what's going on in the conversation generally. But it's a very good book. It's called The Power of Bad, and I strongly recommend it.
Wow, that's a good one. I'm looking forward to reading that. Matt, thanks for coming on the program. It's a real pleasure. You did fantastic, so you didn't lower your status at all in my book, and I can't wait to read your next book whenever that comes out.
Thank you very much, Jake. It's been great to talk to you, and stay well and keep safe.
Before you go, do me the huge honor of picking up your copy of The Rebel Allocator, available on Amazon in both print and digital formats. It's a business person's guide to effective capital allocation, told in a coming-of-age story of a college grad who crosses paths with a wealthy Midwesterner. It's fiction for the nonfiction reader. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interview. If you'd like to support this author and purchase their book, click here. If you'd like to become a subscriber to 5GQ, click here. And I included a couple other interviews that you might appreciate right here. Thanks, happy reading.